I've got this question a few times in the comments. What's my approach to organizing projects? And to be honest, it made me reflect a little bit. What is my actual approach? So today I want to share 5 practical tips I follow to organize any front-end project for better productivity and for very little CSS issues. The first tip, don't start from scratch. I know it might sound obvious, but I've seen people create complicated folder structures for projects that should follow a common pattern. For example, Next.js. There are tons of starters for Next.js, or Laravel or Astro. Chances are you're already working with the framework, so don't waste your time coming up with your own strategy. You can look for open source projects built on the same framework and use those as a starting point. The second tip, use the principle of locality. So when I first started building websites, the main approach was separation of concerns, where you have PHP or HTML in one file, CSS in another file, and JavaScript in another file. That works for extremely tiny projects, but once your CSS grows beyond a few screens, it becomes a scrolling nightmare because you have to scroll like 100 times to find the rule you're looking for. Yes, you can break your styles in multiple files, but then you just replace scrolling with jumping around the project, and that's extremely unproductive. That's why I like the principle of locality much better, where the idea is that you keep related things close together, like in React architecture, for example, where you have the markup, the styles, and the logic for a component all bundled at the same spot. I know that I'm oversimplifying here because you can have context, you could have hooks that you import in the component, you could have utilities, but at least when you're working in that component, you're not jumping around the project. And that's more productive than when you have things scattered around. These first 2 tips were more general. The next one is more front-end focused. Tip number 3, use inverted triangle CSS or ITCSS. ITCSS is a way of organizing your project styles in levels where at the very top you have the least specific styles that apply to the entire project, and at the very bottom the most specific style that do just one thing. So at the top we would have things like variables, mixings, functions, if you use post-CSS or Sass. Sometimes this level doesn't even produce output, and it just defines variables or functions to create other styles. Then further down we have global styles, and that's where you would put box sizing declaration or global outline styles for clickable elements. Then further down we have elements, and that's where we define the generic styles for HTML elements, raw HTML elements without CSS classes or anything applied to them. Like, what's the most generic look for H1? What's the most generic look for H2? And so on. Further down, we have components. In the original ITCSS architecture that Harry Roberts came up with, there's also a layout layer before the components, or objects layer before the components. I find it a little bit complex, so I just introduced components and just use that. Further down, we have utility classes and overrides. And the idea is that any override can override any utility class. Any utility class can override any component, and any component can override any element. And so any element can override any global style. So why am I telling you all this? Because following this architecture dictates how you organize your project. For example, in most cases, I'd create a folder called global and put design tokens, variables, mixings, and other global things in there. And I do the same for the next layer, where I create a file for each raw HTML element inside elements folder. At this point, you might be wondering, Dima, you just told us about the principle of locality, where we keep related things together. Why go back to an architecture that kind of reminds us the separation of concerns? So the thing is, ITCSS is more of a philosophy rather than a strict folder structure, because if you understand the levels, if you understand the mental model, you can organize your styles however you want, as long as you respect the hierarchy. Now, let me show you how these tips apply to a project I'm currently building. I'm currently rebuilding my personal website with Astro, and I'm still learning how it works. So I took their blog starter template and started customizing it. I haven't changed much at a root level. The only thing I've added is the prettier configuration, because I like things my way and I like nicely formatted code, but I don't like wasting time formatting code. I won't dive too deep into the Astro's folder structure because they have really nice documentation. The only thing I'll say is that public is the folder where you put assets that don't require processing, like fonts, favicon, images, and source is where your app actually lives. Here we have components, content if you're using Markdown for content. Then we have pages, and that's how routing works on this project. Anything you put in there, like any file you put in there, creates a route on your website. Then we have styles, and that's where I want to focus most of my attention. Inside the styles folder, we have index CSS, and that's the main entry point for the styles on this project. If I open it, you'll see that we have two imports, global index CSS and then elements index CSS. And that's first two layers of the triangle that we just discussed. Let's look at the global styles first. Here we also have index CSS, and that's the entry point for the global styles. Here we have tokens, variables, and defaults. Let's open tokens first. Tokens is the design tokens, as the name suggests, for the entire project. Here I have variables for font family, for font size, font weight, line height, spacing, and color. And I treat them as sort of like immutable variables, or like, if you want an analogy, like a watercolor palette. Like when you get a watercolor palette, you don't randomly start adding or removing colors. You have, let's say, 8 colors and you stick with them. And then at the variables level, that's where I start mixing those colors. So I have a variable for the size gutter where I use one of the tokens from the previous file. And sometimes I don't reuse values. So for example, I know that inline size content default is the variable that defines the default content width. I will never reuse 37.5 RAM anywhere else. So there's no reason to create a token for that. Next, we have the defaults. And that's what I use sort of like instead of the traditional reset. I don't think that any website should have a reset, to be honest. But anyways, here we have the box sizing declaration. I will probably add outline styles here as well, because they should be consistent on the project. Outline styles is when you use keyboard navigation to go through your project, you see the blue outline, you can style that outline, and that outline should be consistent on every clickable element. So I usually put outline styles in here as well. Now let's look at elements. And here we also have an index CSS file where we import styles for every HTML element that we're using on the website. So we see things like anchor, body, code, heading, and sometimes I would group certain elements together. Like heading CSS, for example, contains styles for headings from H1 to H6. Again, the principle of locality, where we keep related things together. Let's take a look at that file. So here I have global variables that determine how headings look. And again, principle of locality. I want to keep the variable, like even though these variables are global, I want to keep them in the same file because it's related to headings. I don't want to jump to another file to look at what variables are there for headings. What you can also see that I use where pseudo class for these selectors at this level, because I like to have the specificity of these elements at 0, 0, 0. This way I can overwrite any element at this level pretty easily, because components and utility classes will likely have the specificity of 0, 1, 0, or sometimes even higher. Let's get back to the main index CSS. So I'll close all of this. And one thing you may have noticed is that in the main index CSS file, I'm not importing anything after the elements. But in the triangle, we saw that we have components here and utilities and overrides. So the components actually live next to the component markup. So if we close the styles folder and go to the components folder and open any of the components, let's say header, we'll see that I have header Astro, and that's the actual component where all the logic lives, and header CSS, that's the styles for the component. So if I open header Astro, you'll see that I'm importing header CSS at the very top, and Astro is smart enough to include that file on the page. I could also add styles for the component like this using the style tag, but I think having the header CSS import at the top of the file is cleaner, so I'll just leave it at that. In any case, Astro is smart enough to include only the styles for components that appear on the page, which respects both locality and inverted triangle architecture. That's why I'm not importing components inside the main index CSS file. So here I'm in the footer component, and I'm importing the footer styles, that's the component styles for the footer itself. And then I'm importing the utilities from 2 folders above. This might not be the most robust architecture, but if I show you how many utilities I have in the utilities CSS, you'll see that it's not really an issue because I only have one. If this list grows, I would probably figure out a different solution to not load every single utility on every page. As you can see, I'm using the inverted triangle architecture and principle of locality together without creating complex folder structures like the old day with separation of concerns. Now, tip number 4, don't forget to document your decisions. It doesn't have to be anything crazy. The main idea is that engineer that comes after you understands how your project works. You can put a simple README file with the decisions you made for the project. And it doesn't have to be a different engineer. It could be you the next year. Even with my tiny project, I've added a simple README to remind myself like how I've organized the style. So follow ITCSS, use global and element styles on every page, and component level styles for your components. Use clamp whenever you can. I also noted the viewports between which the clamp works, and so on. And last but not least, do not overthink it. If the project structure you have makes you productive, if it makes your team productive, if you're shipping things fast, then it's a good project structure. Do not obsess over small details like whether to break utility classes into subfolders or keep them in the same file. Think about it, make a decision, run it by your team if you need to, and move on to the next task. And I'll see you in the next one.